Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. I've been asked to talk to you today about how police currently detect drug-impaired drivers. Currently. When we look at detecting drug-impaired drivers, we consider driving as a complex task. A complex task that requires someone to divide their attention. As such, we have a few tools that we are able to use to determine if someone is impaired by drug or alcohol. One of the first tools we use is if an officer stops a car on the side of the road, whether it's by a check stop or whether they pull them over, we have the ability to use what's called the standardized field sobriety test. The SFST is a 3-test battery which includes the horizontal gaze and nystagmus test, the walk and turn, and the one-leg stand. If a person performs poorly on the combination of these tests, where they fail these tests, then the officer now has reasonable grounds to believe they're impaired by either alcohol or drug, and as such would read a demand for the person to come back to the detachment or the police department to be engaged with a drug recognition expert and go through a further drug influence evaluation. Of course, the results of that standardized field sobriety test, they're systematic, they're standardized, they're recorded on our form, and of course all of this is disclosable to the court process. You'll see later I'll be doing a demonstration with for Canada, and we're using the impairment symbol to do the walk and turn and the one-leg stand. This is just an example of how we document. We then move on to the major way that we are able to detect and prosecute impaired drivers. Police officers across the province are trained as drug recognition experts. The drug recognition expert program was developed in the 1970s by the Los Angeles Police Department. And we had LA officers that basically were detecting people that they knew were impaired. When they brought them back to the police office, they put them on the breathalyzer at that point in time. They would continuously blow 0 milligrams per cent. However, they would show symptomology of gross impairment. So the officers of the day, working with accepted medical knowledge, devised a systematic and standardized procedure, of course, to determine what category or what categories of drugs the person was impaired by, or if that impairment was then caused by a medical condition. You notice I say category or categories. So when officers are able to detect if someone is impaired by a drug, we simply determine the category of drugs they're impaired by. I can't come up to someone and say, you are impaired by the law. I would use an overarching category. We can use the drug recognition expert process because Bill C-2 was adopted into the criminal code on July 2nd, 2008, which allows police officers in Canada to conduct standardized field sobriety and drug recognition expert tests. You should know that the drug recognition expert program is administered by the International Association of Chiefs of Police. The foundation is a systematic and standardized process. I can tell you that the DRE program is used across Canada, across the United States. There's about 7,300 active drug recognition experts, so it is a fairly robust program. I can tell you there's about 600 of us in Canada. A few years ago in 2012, Nova Scotia had 26 DREs. Currently, right now, we have about 65 police officers that are trained and able to conduct tests on people who they believe are impaired by drugs. This is across all police agencies. It's not just RCMP. We have municipal police officers as well and members of the military police. Well, the question is why do we need DREs? Well, there's no magic box, and I wish there was, but there's no magic box we can use similar to that of alcohol. If police officers currently think that someone is impaired by alcohol, we read them a demand, they come back to attachment, and they blow on what I would call a breathalyzer or generic brand of instrument, determine what blood alcohol concentration is in their body. Current scientific medical knowledge and current per se limit in Canada, of course, is 80 milligrams per cent. If you're anywhere above 80 milligrams per cent, you're considered impaired by alcohol, no matter what type of person it is, no matter what type of body shape or size or your tolerance. Well, we don't really have the same thing for drugs, unfortunately. There's no magic box that we can stick them on. There's no instrument that's currently capable of detecting combination of drug effects. So my previous presenters mentioned cannabis in conjunction with alcohol, okay, which we see on the road as a significant impairment factor than someone who's just impaired by cannabis. Current legislation requires the use of a DRE. There's an availability and access to drugs, of course. There's shifting youth attitudes. There's shifting Canadian values. But remember, again, there's no per se limit for drugs. So not only is there no per se limit for cannabis, there's no per se limit for any of the central nervous system depressants, stimulants like cocaine, amphetamines, or anything of that nature. When we have someone who police believe are impaired by a drug, they come back to detachment, and instead of being hooked to the magic box that we have the breathalyzer for alcohol, the DRE officer goes through a 12-step systematic procedure in order to determine if they're impaired by drug or a combination of the drugs. The 12 steps include a breath test to determine if alcohol is indeed involved with also drug impairment. We would interview the arresting officer to determine what they've seen on the roadside. Was there a crash? Was it a check stop? Was there evidence also obtained? Preliminary examination, and we do a first pulse. So basically what we're trying to do is rule out if the person is involved with a medical condition or in fact they are potentially impaired by a drug. We then go through a process where we examine their eyes, looking for horizontal and vertical gaze nystagmus, because we found that horizontal and vertical gaze nystagmus is indicative of certain categories of drugs. We then go through divided attention tests or psychophysical tests. They include the walk and turn, the one-leg stand, a modified Romper balance test, and a finger-to-nose test. We also then check for vital signs. Different categories of drugs produce different vital signs within the body. For example, central nervous system stimulants tend to elevate pulse rate and blood pressure, where the reverse is true with central nervous system depressants. We conduct a darkroom evaluation, which looks at pupil size. Different drug categories will exhibit different symptomology. We look at muscle tone, again, similar. Injection sites, so for example, how did the person get that drug into their body? Was it injected? Was it smoked? Was it snorted? We talk to them, we interview them. Are there statements they made? Any observations that we see? For example, with cannabis, it tends to produce eyelid tremors and leg tremors when we do our divided attention tests. Then the drug recognition expert member will make an opinion. They'll make the opinion number one, if they believe that subject is impaired, and number two, what category or categories of drugs is that person impaired by. If the DRE believes they're impaired, they then obtain a toxicological sample, which includes make-in demand for blood or urine of that individual. That urine then, of course, is sent to the lab, which will corroborate with the opinion of the DRE. The member who is the DRE member will record all their observations on the drug influence evaluation face sheet. You'll see it's much larger, much more things on it than the standardized field sobriety test face sheet you saw earlier. Earlier I alluded to the fact that different categories of drugs create different symptomology in the body. And this is used with current medical knowledge. And there's different things that we look for as a result of the DRE evaluation. For example, horizontal gaze nystagmus, the reaction to light, the blood pressure and muscle tone are seen on the vertical boxes on the category. Across the top, you'll see the different categories of drugs. There's 7 that DREs are trained to look for, including central nervous system depressants, inhalants, dissociative anesthetics, cannabis, central nervous system stimulants, hallucinogens, and narcotic analgesics. Again, the different categories produce different observable effects. The DRE will not specifically say you're directly impaired by an opiate. It's just the category of drugs that produce those effects. Cannabis is a little different because cannabis is its own category. So usage within the province of Nova Scotia. Again, taking into account that we're building the program within the province, the number of charges that we've had, or number of drug-impaired drivers we've been able to detect and charge over the years has increased. In 2013, we laid 64 charges for drug-impaired driving across all police forces and agencies. 110 in 2014, 101 in 2015, and to date, this was a month ago when I had to do the stats because the presentation was due a month ago. Only 22. So those numbers are increasing. We have some fairly good success in the province in relation to the use of the Drug Recognition Expert Program and the court system in convicting impaired drivers. In 2011, there was a case of McDonald in Port Hawkesbury. Mr. McDonald was involved in a high-speed chase. Police officers stopped him in the community of Orangedale. The officer detected signs of cannabis-impaired driving. He used a standardized field sobriety test, which he failed. The subject was brought back and a DRA test was conducted, and then the case proceeded to court. Mr. McDonald was convicted of cannabis-impaired driving. We also have the notable case of Mr. Fogarty. That was in Anne Ignition 2013. This is a case of a double fatality in the community of tragedy. Mr. Fogarty was impaired by a central nervous system depressant. In this case, a standardized field sobriety test was not used because the officer determined the symptomology impairment was considerable. Mr. Fogarty had a DRE evaluation conducted on him. He failed the DRE evaluation. The officer made the opinion that it was a central nervous system depressant, and that was confirmed by toxicology. He was convicted and sentenced to 6 years in federal penitentiary. That is the first double fatality in Canada that's been used for case law across the country. Here's some information for you. I'm sure everyone likes a few stats. Here's who we're catching. We currently see cannabis as the dominant category of impaired drivers that we catch. Overwhelmingly, then we have central nervous system depressants, narcotic analgesics, and then stimulants. Again, these are just people we catch. Gender, overwhelmingly male. Catching males impaired by drug. That's not necessarily to say females are not impaired by drug, but it's simply that we're catching currently more males than females. And here are your age groups. These are just who we catch and who we charge. We see there are some bumps between the 20 and 24 year age group and the 30 to 34 year age group. The way I like to look at this is, unfortunately, we see a lot of people who are impaired by drugs operating a motor vehicle. And sometimes age is not a factor. Any questions for me?